It's not a job, it's a lifestyle, and you're asked to do things that no one else is asked to do. We want something that's lasting, that's credible, that's fixed, that's enduring.
Get on with it. This is no longer in the too hard basket because people are dying.
Welcome to Life on the Line. I'm Alex Lloyd, hosting two previous guests of the show in a special panel discussion. You can listen to this episode in your usual podcast app or watch our Zoom recording on YouTube. On August 11th, the Interim Report of the Royal Commission into Defence and Veterans Suicide was submitted to the Governor-General and then to Parliament. While this podcast sees itself as a veteran storytelling platform first and foremost, topics as exceptional as this are an ongoing part of the stories of veterans and families around the country. As a nation, we've lost more veterans to suicide than we did to combat in the Afghanistan and Iraq wars. This Royal Commission was something tirelessly campaigned for by veterans and families, so this interim report is an important measure of whether it's achieving what so many wanted it to. To discuss the interim report, we've welcomed back two previous guests. Wes H. Hennessey is a veteran of the 2nd Commando Regiment, a deeply experienced and well-decorated soldier after many combat deployments to Afghanistan. H, welcome back to the show.
G'day, Alex. It's great to be back.
Renee Wilson is the CEO of Australian War Widows New South Wales, an ambassador for the Commando Welfare Trust, and is a staunch advocate for veterans and their families. She is also the wife of veteran Gary Wilson, who was significantly injured in a helicopter crash in Afghanistan. Renee, welcome back to the show.
Hi, Alex. Thank you for having me.
H, Renee, we have a 348-page report to condense to an hour's discussion of what it says, what it's got right, and otherwise. Where do we start? H.
So first of all, I'd like to thank you very much, Alex and Life on the Line, for hosting us today and providing this opportunity through your platform. I think it's extremely important, as you've highlighted, to your listeners and all others in the community and wider community. Huge thank you, Renee, for accepting the invite. I know you've done a lot of work on the report with the Royal Commission, and I also know you do a lot of work well before that and around that. So I can't thank you enough for the work that you do, especially with veterans, families, and etc. The first thing I'd like to acknowledge is the persons who have contributed to the report and have made the report possible. And I think first and foremost, and there's too many to go into individually, so what I would like to do is just particularly pay note to the persons who have given lived experiences to the Royal Commission. And I would just like everyone to acknowledge that every single one of those persons that has given that experience has relived a traumatic experience. And that can't be underestimated, the toll of that on those people. So there's a lot of people that have contributed, but there's a significant body of people that have contributed, which has caused them to relive trauma. So we should acknowledge them. The intent of this, as Alex has briefly mentioned, there's too much to deep dive. So we are going to wave top it a little bit, but we'll just go through the recommendations. Is the rough format? Some of them would be grouped because they are all based off a similar area, whether that be DVA or a legislation or parliamentary thing. Then myself and Renee will just bring up some particular miscellaneous points that we've each chosen and would like to go into. So again, it's not going to be exhaustive. There's 348 pages. We have trying to keep to a timeline and also to make it interesting to the main topics for defence, families, veterans, and others that may be listening. So without further ado, I've asked Renee to start. She's got a lot more experience in handle, as I've already said, in some of these topics, been in a lot more meetings than myself. So without further ado, I'll hand over to you, Renee, to go over the first group of recommendations.
Thanks, H. Before I get into that, I too would just like to acknowledge every single individual who has come forward and I like to say has really put themselves in one of the most vulnerable situations they can, whether that is through writing their story and telling the commission, or probably an incredibly vulnerable thing, and that is to appear before the commission and tell your story in real life to a room full of strangers that you don't know, and that don't know you, don't know your experiences, and to put yourself out there to be judged really speaks to the passion of these individuals to make the system better for those that come after. So I'd like to acknowledge them. I'd like to thank them, because it is incredibly difficult. I'd also like to acknowledge both Alex, you, and H, and in particular H, because you've been there but in a different way. You've shared your vulnerability that has enabled many veterans to come forward and get this courage themselves to share their stories. You've also highlighted to me some of the bigger, more strategic pieces to help me ask the questions around why, or what I like to say, yes, but why. I'm going off topic a little bit, Alex. I'll get into trouble for it later. But even if we, for a minute, just think about this, and you think about the war crimes investigation, my question is always, yes, but why? So, even if the worst happened, my question is why? And I'd like to thank you, Alex, for putting these stories out there so that you are forcing all of us who have never served to understand and think and acknowledge and learn about the unique nature of military service, and people like you that just put it out there so that people can understand. So thank you both. Similar to H, I'd like to acknowledge all of the effort that went into that 348-page report. I can't imagine anything more difficult than to summarise 12 months worth of evidence. And, I have to say, I have interacted with the commissioners. I've appeared before the commission, and it feels like a safe space. And if you are out there and you are wondering, am I relevant? The answer is yes. Will I be heard? The answer is yes. Is it a safe space to be heard? The answer is yes. And so I'd really like to acknowledge the commissioners and their team for creating that space for us to have what is an incredibly difficult conversation. And of course, all of the policy team to bring something like this together. These reports don't just happen. And we might now go into some of the things that are not quite there, but that's not a bad thing, and that's not a comment or basically saying the commission isn't doing their job. The commission, it's a process, and it's a process that we as a veteran community are learning about as we're going through it. So turning to the recommendations, the first one, well, there's a number that are kind of all a bit similar. So the first one that I'm going to look at is eliminating the claims backlog. Then we move into improving the administration. And then the next one kind of rolls on about DVA's funding needs and staffing caps. They're all kind of related to the same thing. For my mind, I think what's important here is acknowledging that the claims backlog that is being referred to and is grabbing all of the headlines at the moment is the front door, if you like. These are the initial liability claims. What's important is to be mindful, and I would really call on the government and suggest to the government to be thinking about second and third order consequences to these recommendations when they accept them, because I don't think they have a choice not to, given the evidence that's been presented before the commission. DVA has been under-resourced for the longest possible time. However, there is also a lot of, in my view, a lot of short-sighted thinking. We think about the initial thing. So, the claims backlog, for instance, it's about, times taken to process. It's about, how quickly can we assess a claim? Can we get it over the line and get the veteran into the system? what we need to be careful of is that we don't move those 42,000 people from the front door to the living room, because the system and the DVA system is already under pressure in every part of its business, including for the veterans that are already in there and on their books. So, you know, a recent example is, and this is a personal example, but in trying to maintain the household services that we have because of my husband's injuries, it was getting to the point where we were going to have to try to find another provider again, because DVA wasn't paying the bills because their account system was backed up to the hilt, and it was taking them 40, 50 days to turn around an invoice. So I think it's really important to not just look at, this is more than just a numbers game. And the government really needs to think about bolstering the rest of the system all the way along, so that as that veteran comes through the front door and the department then becomes open for business for them, it's really important to make sure that they're ready to take them. Because I would argue that the evidence that we've heard so far from DVA and the evidence that's presented in here, I'm not sure that that's the case. And that goes to the point around resourcing. These recommendations are all about give DVA more resources, give DVA more resources. It's important those resources are used appropriately. You know, in most governments and government departments, we all know that resources aren't always, they're not very efficient. So I think thinking about how do we do this effectively, thinking about looking outside the box for solutions as well, is really important to make sure that the right decisions are made with whatever resources will flow through from this report to DVA. The one other observation I'd make is, in particular, the elimination of the claims backlog and the employment of all of these staff, and the recommendation to remove the average staffing level cap. Anyone who's an employer at the moment will tell you or ask you, where are all these people that I need to employ? So there's a really base assumption here that, you know, there's all these people out there waiting to be employed by the department and by the government. And, you know, while that might be the case, the market is incredibly tight at the moment, and we need these people to hit the ground running if that claims backlog is going to be eliminated, and eliminated quickly. So I think there's that base assumption that I'm not sure has been tested against the current employment environment.
Can I just inject there, Renee? So just I'll go back in reverse. So on that, I think it's really important to understand just something one step further. Renee touched on at the back of that there, and that's the recruiting process. So, and this was highlighted, I'll admit, this was only highlighted to me with discussions with a advocate on Vietnam's Veterans Day on Thursday. And we're having a discussion. And she said, but you know what the problem is going to be, H, or what people don't think about, and like I said, Renee's alluded to it, is then the training. So not only do we need to find and recruit the right people, and I'm by no means making excuses, but that's what we want to do in this, is just set some realities there for people. You know, it's good to read this and go, yeah, I know DVA are, I was going to use a profanity, but we all know what people generally say about DVA. It's easy to make that statement. What we need to look at and think and make people aware, because then you can manage expectations, right? And this is the problem, is people don't know how long things are taking and why. So to help manage those expectations, so just say if we were to grow DVA by, and I don't know these figures, I'm just going to throw some stuff out there. If we were to grow DVA by 20%, so just say that's hiring an X amount of personnel. Now, by the time they write all those job descriptions, et cetera, in detail, send them out to a recruiting agency, the recruiting agent goes through screening processes, then they go through to final interviews, then they're recruited, then they need to be inducted as anybody does into an organization, then they need to be trained. So we've made a lot of progress so far in this first year with the commission, but for people to think that this commission is going to have this wave of change that's going to come, it will start a wave of change, but I do not see a fast process occurring. So I think people need to understand that first and foremost. three other things, or the three legislative things, which I won't go into, but so people can understand where the complexity and confusion lies for veterans and defence persons. So there are three schemes, and I'm by no means an expert on it, but one's a veterans, one's called a veterans rehabilitation, one's a defence rehabilitation, and one is a military rehabilitation. So they're all complete different components of legislation and policy. So if you look at someone like myself, for example, who joined as a young lad in the 90s and went through his 20-odd year service and left at, when did I leave? December 2014. So someone like that gets captured or is captured under all three of these legislations. What does that mean? It means depending when and what my claim is, that the injury or illness, where I provide the evidence for that claim to be claimed under, it depends what legislation it comes under. So, for example, someone like myself will have multiple things being claimed after multiple legislations and policies, and then all of those have sort of got amendments, or some have got a few amendments over time as well. What does this mean? It means an extremely complicated system, and that's, that's what we all knew, but that is a key, thankfully, recommendation that's come out of the Royal Commission, that these three legislative guidance documents and all the associated policy make for an extremely complicated compensation system, which makes it extremely protracted. Just to finish on this little piece, again, what does that mean? And because this is so emotive, you will note me through this, and I mean in the most respectful way, talk a little bit about data, and I actually enjoy maths. The thing with data and numbers is they're unemotive and they don't lie. 1 + 1 is 2, 2 + 2 is 2. So I think it's important we just understand that. So noting the three MERCA, I'll refer to them as MERCA, DIRCA, and VEA as they're colloquially referred to. So DVA has a performance timeline that they put against these three legislations, and that is a timeline that they've said they should be able to turn that claim around in. So for MERCA, it's 90 days, and that's both for an initial, and I'm reading here on purpose, for initial liability and the permanent impairment. For incapacity, it's 50 days. For DIRCA, it's 100 days. And you can see there's different days because the legislations are different and different requirements, hence my previous point. And then for VEA, it's 100 days. Now, again, referring to the report, what does that mean? The current claim process timelines for VEA, noting what I previously said, so it's 350%, so it's sitting just under 350 days. And for MERCA and DIRCA, without going in all the little worms here, we'll just agree that it's between 325, about 250 to 325, depending on types of claims and stuff. The point being, the time that the DVA has said that they aim for, so what's their best practice to get the claims turned around and responses given, etc., and to look after our veterans and defence persons, are all up anywhere from 250 to 350%. That there has been acknowledged, and again, we knew it, but the report has formally acknowledged it, is a massive, massive issue for veterans, because they don't know when their issues are going to be resolved. Remember, resolution for a veteran and a defence person is about their quality of life and being able to move on. So they're given, importantly, some financial support and some medical support, because remember, they're claiming for something, so generally they've got some medical issues, so they don't have these impounding bills. Now, those years, as it is here, that goes on, puts them in this, puts them in an unknown area with their life and lifestyle. And that's where we've also found that they're most susceptible, because they can't buy a house, or they can't rent a place, they can't set themselves up, they can't start working again because it may go against one of the legislations until the legislation's been cleared, and then they end up in this circle. I'll hand back over to Renee.
H, if I can just add a couple of observations to all of the important information you just shared about the legislation. I think it's important to also recognise the underpinning philosophies between the three of them. So why are they different? The Veterans Entitlement Act was introduced as part of the cornerstone of the repatriation system when the repatriation system was introduced, and that was to recognise the unique nature of military service, its impacts on veterans and on their families, eventually their families, mainly including the widows. It was there to recognise that veterans had been to war and they were forever changed by that war. Then the philosophy behind the system changed at some point. I don't have the dates to hand, but the then government of the day, we as Australia, and as the world, we're in this long, as in the Western world, we're in this long period of peace. So a decision was made to bring in another piece of legislation because veterans weren't going to war anymore. And that was what was then called the Safety Rehabilitation Compensation Act, now called the Defence, blah, 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 DERCA. The underlying philosophy of that is basically a workers' compensation scheme. So it really, to a certain extent, changed the system from one that recognised the unique nature of military service and all of its flow-on effects to one that was now about workers' compensation. And the idea was they would work together. So if a veteran was deployed, then they'd be covered under the VEA. If a veteran stayed in Australia the whole time, then, all sustained injuries as part of their normal occupational risks and hazards, then they'd be covered under the other. It was quickly realised that there was a need to perhaps take the best of both and smush them into another piece of legislation, which is how I've ended up with MERCA. The fundamental difference between MERCA and the other two is that MERCA is really based around rehabilitation, and it tries to emphasize rehabilitation and getting back to a normal-ish life following the impacts of service. The VEA was very much almost like an American-based system. You've been to war, you've been injured, you're now retired. So I think the philosophies are all very different, which is and all of those have just been handed off to the Department of Veterans Affairs to administer. And it's really difficult because how do you reconcile those philosophies? How do you tell one person, because you were injured in this time period, that must be related to peacetime service, so therefore we're going to treat you like a workers' comp claim? And in fact, where the Safety Rehabilitation Compensation Act started was a system that started in Defence, and Defence handed it over to DVA to administer. So it was always set up as a workers' comp scheme. I think we have to also recognise that this isn't the first time that recommendations have been made to harmonise the legislation and to get on with it. What I like about the Royal Commission pointing to it and really amplifying all of the evidence and all of the other reports that have recommended the same thing is it's just saying, get on with it. This is no longer in the too hard basket because people are dying. And we simply cannot continue the way we're continuing. DVA has always put it in the too hard basket because some veterans organisations and associations are very unhappy. And we always look at the potential losses. And there are ways around this, and we need to just do it. We need to get on as a community, and we need to recognise that this generation of veterans is saying enough is enough. And there is no more urgent action required than to harmonise those pieces of legislation, make the hard decisions and get on with it. I think the other thing I just wanted to reflect back when H was talking about the initial liability claims and it taking, 300 days, 250 days, we have to remember what's happening to that veteran in the interim. And yes, having access to medical treatment is important. Having, access to financial support in that time is important if they're unable to work. But when we reflect on, well, any of us, how would any of us feel if we put in a claim and we heard we got access to a few things, but we heard almost nothing from the organisation until that claim had either been accepted or denied, and that's probably just a letter because they're under the pump already. What happens to your family? Well, there is a huge increase in emotional and mental pressure in that household. That veteran is angry about the fact that they've heard nothing and doesn't know. And, it's scary. It's scary because these claims are people's lives. They're not just pieces of paper. And that just increases the pressure across all of the household. Dad's angry now all the time and the kids don't know why. And, and I'm being quite gendered here, so please forgive me. But, mum's sitting there going, I don't know what's going on. And I'm trying to manage this emotional and mental load. I'm trying to manage his behaviour. I'm trying to keep the kids calm so they know it's not their fault. This is everything that happens in those 350 days.
And I think we should also acknowledge, and what has been acknowledged is through that time, and you hit on it, Renee, is nothing gets, well, generally speaking, not many things get better with time when we're talking about a negative issue. So whatever their health issue is, it's getting worse and worse and worse. And then especially when we're talking about mental health, they start to ruminate. If people aren't aware of rumination, it's a huge thing. It's a huge issue with a lot of people where basically you get in that spiraling or circular motion where the problems aren't getting worse, but you make them worse because your thought process gets into this cyclic spin and it amplifies what's happening in your head. And it's only happening in your head. But the point is, and as Renee said, that unknown, it just makes it worse. And again, the strains across families, across finances, because they may need more meds or they may need to, in fact, be hospitalised. They may need some home care. Anyway, the point is that, it just gets worse and worse. Another, as Renee alluded to, there's been 50 reports, and this again comes up in the recommendations here. There's been 50 reports done over the last however many years. Sorry, don't quote me. And out of those 50 reports, numerous governments have concluded 750 odd recommendations. Now, a problem that the Royal Commission's having is seeking clarification on what and why and whether components of those recommendations were in fact followed through or not. And this is a big problem, and hence why it is one of the urgent fixes in the Royal Commission. So it's important that everyone understands that. And they're quoting things like parliamentary privilege, etc. So basically, that because an in confidence discussion was had with myself and a minister, that I don't need to divulge that information, and that's basically sort of stonewalling as people are seeing it within the Commission, and it's being extremely hindered progress in certain things. So what the Royal Commission needs to know and understand, so they can receive all this information, but there's also a ton of information that's previously been received. And out of that information that's been received, as I've said, 750 recommendations were made. So we need to know exactly what the recommendations were and why and what decision processes. So what the cycle was by various ministers at that time as to why they did or did not do what we don't know whether they've done. So lifting that cloud off that and will certainly help. And how that will help is we won't repeat, or there doesn't need to be a duplication in work. If the review's been done on something and it's found to be credible, which is the assumption, and just, and the recommendations were made, then they can capture that now and add it to existing work. So that's a really big thing. And I will be honest, that was something that surprised me. It didn't surprise me. I knew there was a lot of previous, reviews. I wasn't aware that the figure was 50 odd, and I wasn't aware that there's 750 odd recommendations out there. But what particularly frustrated me, and I know it's frustrated many others, is the fact that ministers in all different parties of government, also different elements of previous governments and ministers, are now stonewalling the access of that information based on the privilege that they have under parliamentary privilege. And I think that's really, really bad taste.
H, if I could just jump in there, just to kind of distill some of the points that you and Renee have made so far, in that some of the issues comes down to personnel, recruitment, and not having enough people on the ground to get the work done. And that's obviously a more complex problem. But then a lot of what you're describing just comes down to a lack of political willpower. And that's across the years, that's currently. And that if one of the key issues is just this legislative mess, then it's such a simple recommendation to, I know it's simple to say and then harder to actually execute a change, but if a lot of it's just willpower, then what do we then do as a veteran community? I say that as veterans and people associated within that community, what do we do to sort of lobby for that change? Because if we have a Royal Commission highlighting the shocking suicide rate, if that's not moving the dial sufficiently to prompt change, what's next steps for us?
I think all we can continue to do is initiatives like this, is to write letters, and persons who knew me 10 or 15 years ago, they'd sort of have a giggle at coming out of my mouth. But frankly, highly emotive and angry statements and lashing out. And for the listeners, we agreed prior to this not to go into persons, not to mention, there's a lot of people I could mention who I don't think were the political persons or others who haven't helped this. This is not what this is about. We need to speak about the bodies. We need to speak about the organisations, and we need to continue through every platform that we can find. And I welcome, and I know so does Renee, and so does Alex, that any person who listens to this, as in any media person, that wants to expand or would like us to talk on this, and I do not consider myself an expert by any means. But if they want further clarification, if they want further comment, if they want debate, then we're willing to do that. What we're trying to do here, and one of the key intents that we all spoke of prior to this, is to highlight some points, to start a conversation, to use another organisation's catchphrase, and to hopefully, influence some of the decision makers and policy makers before they're made. Because we should also highlight that no one at this stage has said anything other than they welcome the Royal Commission. So they welcome the interim report, and they've made certain comments and remarks about the recommendations. But no one has signed up to any direct action yet. And to be fair, it is early, but I certainly would expect people to be putting a date on things soonest, and that would be in the next week or two. The recommendations are highlighted as urgent. And as Renee said before, this has been going on forever. It's time for change. It's time for action. I mentioned the other day to a minister that after he made a statement on the interim report, and he said that they would make recommendations off the recommendations in due course. I think that language is not acceptable. I think people look at that as unacceptable now. There is, as I said, the recommendations are highlighted as urgent. And as the current government's going with a defence review, that'll be the quickest defence review we've ever done. And, kudos to them. They put a date on it, and it's a sharp date, early next year, whenever it is. So I think people now should be putting dates on this, and that reassures everyone, involved in the chain that, okay, on this date, we're going to hear this. It's not good enough to say in due course, but I think that's enough on that.
If I can add to that, I think, well, there's a few things that have come out of that, both Alex, in addressing your question, which I'll get to in a second, but also in what H was just talking about prior. What this interim report shows us, and not us, I'm speaking about every single Australian here. So not us in our microcosm, in our community, everything in here we already know. What it's demonstrating and proving, and this is an important point, is what, yes, the Productivity Commission has already said, but it's proving in a way in which it will connect with the Australian public that this veteran system doesn't meet their expectations. This veteran system is in fact out of date and isn't supporting veterans in the way the Australian community expects. I would also go so far as to say, because otherwise I would be doing myself and my organisation a disservice, it also, the Australian community, and I know this from being out in different elements of it, expects that veterans' families are also taken care of by this system, because the Australian community seems to understand, and I'm talking big picture, but everyone from, you know, your colleague at work who isn't a veteran family or isn't connected to a veteran, to doctors and GPs, to big business, to other ministers, not the Veterans Minister, but other ministers, everyone seems to understand that the unique nature of military service impacts more than just a veteran. But it seems in this veteran system, we're still having debates about what is our responsibility to veterans' families, who is responsible. Put very simply, I don't care. And either do the veterans' families. Enough is enough. The Australian community knows. So it's about time that we stood up and paid attention.
Can I just jump in there? I just want to read a paragraph. Sorry, Renee, because you just did an excellent lead into a paragraph I wanted to read later. I'll read it now. In reference to what Renee's saying, so I'm going to quote this. We've also heard how partners have struggled with the ADF's members' erratic and sometimes dangerous behaviour, their substance abuse, instances of domestic violence and depression, anxiety and suicidality. Because of injuries or mental disorders acquired due to their service. For this reason, it is important to understand what the research says about the impacts on family members' well-being and to what extent DVA and ADF are aware of the research findings. One thing I've, informally as an informal advocate, it's just helping people and receiving phone calls. And I've dealt over the years, when I was in the military because of my seniority and position, with a lot of girlfriends, partners, wives. We certainly weren't in the business of sweeping things under the mat. We're in the business of looking after the member. And I say that unashamedly because that is or was, as a uniform member, my priority. Now, that's not saying that I wouldn't do all I could to look after the families. The point of the matter here, and again, the military, any member in the Australian Defence Force, it's not a job, it's a lifestyle, and you're asked to do things that no one else is asked to do. So we need to acknowledge that. So that's why it's extremely important that this goes beyond the serving member and it goes all the way down and through. And I'll go into some other quotes later. I'll just hand back over to Renee on effects of the children, 20, 30, 40 years after war, after one of their parents have been in a combat or been deployed, and the effects on those. But sorry, Renee, back to you.
Well, H, just if I can go to one point that you just talked about in very simplistic terms, which is excellent, I think, because it really resonates, the unique nature of military service and why, it's why it has ripple effects beyond the veteran, but also why we must take care of those people. But I'm just going to add a little bit more. We need to remember that in Australia, these people are volunteers. They volunteer for this life. They sign up for this life, and their life is about service to their country. Australia is incredibly lucky that we are able to have a volunteer-based system where there isn't any form of mandatory service where there isn't any form of conscription since Vietnam. But we need to nurture that. And we need to look after these people who voluntarily put their hand up, and the families that stand behind them and say, you can have my son and daughter. Because really, you know, a lot of these people sign up at a very early age. So who is the family member at that point? It's normally the parents. It's important that we nurture that and that we create a system that people know, no matter what happens to me, and those families know, no matter what happens to my loved one, will be looked after. We've got a unique opportunity right now to build that system because of what we already know right now through this report and all the evidence the Commission has heard. It's not fit for purpose.
Just jumping off sorry, Renee, just to jump on that comment though, it's something where we have a great reputation as for our Defence Force to have some of the best training, some of the best gear, some of the best opportunities in uniform, and the reputation of our soldiers on deployments like our time in Afghanistan, all that, second to none. And to have that world class while in uniform, and then to have so little duty of care, so little care and regard and training for life after service, all that afterwards, the contrast is shocking. And I think the report's really putting that into focus.
But Alex, building on that point, which kind of just takes us back to some of the points that H raised before about, you know, parliamentary privilege being used and the Royal Commission not having access to all of the information it needs. The Royal Commission must have access to information. I can't put it any more simply. Do they have to release it all publicly? No, but they need access to information, because another key point of this, which is what all of those veterans and their families who fought for this commission fought for, is accountability. And you kind of hit the nail on the head, Alex, when you said, you know, duty of care. That's a really important part. But if the Royal Commission and the commissioners and their council team don't have access to the information, if things are being kept draft so they don't have to be released, then we've got a serious problem, because how are we going to fix this system if we're not giving the people who are tasked with the job of looking end to end at what's happening, we're not giving them access to the information? It's simply unacceptable. So I support all of those recommendations in the report. But building on, going back to your earlier point, Alex, and, you know, H has already touched on this as well, what can we do? I think, you know, there's a number of things we can do, but what we need to be thinking about two things. There's a whole lot of evidence in this report. None of what is presented in here, none of these recommendations prohibit any organisation or anyone in the veteran community acting on what is already known in this report. So, you know, that's a bit of a call to action for the community part of the veteran community. That's too many communities. The non-for-profit charity part to, you know, and businesses to come together, to collaborate, to look at what the evidence is in here, to understand what is our unique value as an organisation. And I'm going to do a cheeky plug for mine. You know, our unique value is we have existed for 76 years to advocate for the inclusion of veterans' families at a very high level. We were successful in getting war widows into the veteran system. Now we're going to advocate hard to ensure that all veterans' families are included in the veteran system. We also provide a wraparound support service for widows predominantly. Now we're going to be able to provide that for veterans' families. And we do that in ways of, you know, social connection, health and wellbeing, and we're building a case management function. So I think it's about, number one, each organisation understanding their unique part of the pie and what value that adds to the broader system, because there's a lot that I and my organisation can already do in here with the evidence that we've got. And I would call on every other veterans organisation to take these learnings and do the same thing. But what's critical is that we all come together, because we don't have resources to waste in this sector, and we need to make sure that we're being complementary to each other. the other thing is, as individuals, as representatives of organisations, as we're thinking about, well, should we make a submission to the Commission? We need to be thinking about how can we help them. So in the last few days, the pennies dropped for me. We've got our 3 or 4 advocacy points. We've got the things that we really want to see as a result of this commission. You need to drill down on that. We need to now go to them with the solutions. We need to tell them what we want. We need to help them understand why we want it. And we need to help them understand what needs there are in the community that need to be addressed. So it's, whether you're an individual who should be telling your story in order to give them more evidence to justify everything. If you're an organisation, you need to go on. We must help this commission. We must help these commissioners, and we must continue to bring as much evidence forward as possible. There's been an extension to the written submissions deadline, and we all must get behind that.
There's a great point there, Renee, about the .orgs and ESOs, etc. It's no secret that I've made many statements about them before. When you look at the amount of these organisations that are registered, and then you look at the amount that you hear daily doing work, good work with veterans across the whole community, not a select little group. When you look at the organisations that are being extremely transparent financially as to where and what donations are being used for. As Renee has alluded to there, none of you, the thousands of ESOs, whoever you are, that are registered, none of you need to wait a day longer to do anything. So if you're serious about helping defence and the veteran community, then start now. There's no need to wait. There are so many little and big things, but what I mean is you could start with the smallest, and move forward from there. And one of my favourite sayings: every pair of jeans started with one thread. So we need to all get start threading basically. And the other excellent point, which also I do a bit of, if there's any businesses. And this isn't a plug so much. This is, I'll help you. If there's any businesses out there that are wondering, as I've had some approach me before and we've helped, how do I help this community? Then get in contact with us. I'm not saying that I'm the font of all knowledge on how to do that, but if I don't know, I'll certainly direct you to an organisation that will and can. Or recommend you to, again, we're not mentioning any by name here today deliberately, but recommend you to an ESO or an organisation that is daily doing good work and is credible and is transparent. So I think that's also a really good point that Renee made, that there's no need to wait another year. And if you remember, one of the first conversations we've had on this recording, as we're talking about the recruiting process and the training process of DVA and how much needs to happen. And we need to acknowledge the stress on that organisation. Like, frankly, would you like to work in DVA right now? No, it would be an extremely stressful, difficult place to work. So noting what we've previously said about everything that needs to happen there, it's going to take more years, not months, years. It's just impossible to do it faster and to do it well. We don't want to quickly do things here. We want something that's lasting, that's credible, that's fixed, that's enduring, and all the other adjectives I can think of. So,
well, Renee, it strikes me that although this is such an important conversation we're having, this won't be the first time in Australian history that these conversations have been had, maybe at this public level and in a Royal Commission sense, but this isn't the first time this has happened. We can look, and history goes in cycles, it repeats itself. And I've seen, just through doing this podcast, I've seen a lot of repetition, a lot of parallels between, say, Vietnam veterans and Afghanistan, Iraq veterans. You can extend that back to Korea and World War II if you want. But I think Vietnam also has other synergy and parallels, politically speaking, in some regards. Can we look back to previous generations and take lessons from there and apply that to the data and to the testimonials we're getting in this Royal Commission and try and have some good progress come from that?
Yeah, definitely, Alex. One of the points, and noting Vietnam's Veterans Day, as I've mentioned, the 60th anniversary was only a few days ago. Well, prior to that, as I was reading through the report leading up to that day, it particularly struck me, one of the paragraphs, which again I will read out of here because I think it's important to just get this exactly right, in regards to the Vietnam veterans' children, as in their dependents, and the effects on those. So they've got some data on it, and I will be honest, this totally struck me out of field. I just can't believe these figures. A 2014 study commissioned by DVA considered the impacts of deployment on the children of Vietnam veterans. The study found a high lifetime rates of suicidal ideation in the children of Vietnam veterans up to 40 years after their parent had been deployed. The study compared conscripted Vietnam veterans who had been deployed in any operational role to Vietnam, referred to as Vietnam veterans, and the Vietnam-era military conscripts who had not been deployed to Vietnam, referred to as Vietnam-era personnel, and then controlled the socioeconomic and educational differences. So very quickly, they're talking about persons who were deployed to Vietnam and persons who were in the military but didn't deploy to Vietnam, just so people aren't confused. Comparing the adult children of deployed Vietnam veterans with those of Vietnam-era non-deployed personnel, the study found suicidal ideation rates of 41% for the children of deployed Vietnam veterans compared to 31% of non-deployed Vietnam-era personnel. In comparison, the rate for general population was 16%. So in summary, the general population through that era, 16%. For the Vietnam veterans, as in the persons who deployed to the Vietnam War, we're talking 41%. Now, those figures, it takes a little bit to sort of rock my boat. I was extremely astounded by them. The point is, coming back to an earlier point about families. So here are the children of a veteran. So they never joined anything. They never signed up for anything. The children of a family 40 years later, you know, at 41% higher degree of suicidal ideation. You know, that's just an horrific figure. And again, comes back to the other points we've been making, that, you know, this is a lifestyle, and we need to certainly have a focal point on veterans, but we also now need to extend that net or the umbrella or whatever analogy you want to use to the families, and in particular the children. And remember, children as an adult, we are more conditioned to cope with things in general terms, you know, from a psychological perspective. And I'm not a psychologist, but from a psychological perspective, it's a fact that an adult is more conditioned in general terms to cope with things. Children are not. So the children are always going to be more susceptible, and due to that susceptibility, we must be a lot more considerate of the effects of the veterans' deployment or deployments upon those children. So it's just a point I wanted to raise because, like I said, out of everything I've read in here, it's something that really jumped out at me.
Just if I can build on that, H, and just pick up some of the language in this report where it talks about trauma-informed care. I would observe that trauma-informed care is important, but we must take a long-term view on that. And that brings up it builds on a couple of the points that you've made there, where I know through personal experience, and it's also demonstrated by that data that you've just referred to, when someone experiences something traumatic, or, you know, whether that's vicarious trauma or that's, you know, a trauma that they're experiencing themselves, it doesn't always manifest straight away. In fact, it can manifest years later, and the realization can manifest years later. So just to go personal for a second, I really struggle with debilitating anxiety when it's related to health and healthcare. Now, did that come from Gary's deployment? No. That came from work that I used to do many years ago as a young lawyer, assisting the coroner, where we would investigate deaths and we would try to make sure that they could be prevented. So how does that manifest now for me? I get sick, one of the kids gets sick, automatically I go straight to they're about to die and I must intervene now because I've seen too much of what happens when you don't. So that is, I don't even want to know. I don't know because I already feel old. Years ago. But not only does it manifest, it probably manifested for a while before that, but I didn't realize what it was till now. So that's an important point. I think the other part that you raised, there is already research out there that tells us people who are bereaved by a death are already at a significantly higher risk than the general population of suicide. People who are bereaved by suicide are at an even higher risk of suicide than that former group that I referred to. And those children are at the highest risk. We know a lot already about the impacts of adverse childhood experiences. Now, there's a suite of them. The schools at the moment will the schools I've had experience with will screen for them. They want to know, have your children been exposed to anything that could potentially be, that is an adverse childhood experience? So there's a suite of them. Everything from mother being mentally ill, mental illness in the household, parents being imprisoned, multiple moves. There's also, less dramatic ones as well, but nonetheless, they're traumatic for children because children don't understand. And H, you raise an important point. Adults are conditioned with coping skills, but those coping skills have their infancy in childhood. So if we can teach these children to move through the traumas, we can already flag them in the system. We know who they are, and we can start to give them the skills that they need to help seek, to form attachments, to make sure that their needs are met, even if those needs can't be met by their parents. Then we're equipping them for the best possible future they can have. We're mitigating the traumas that have already happened to them. So turning back to this topic, in my mind, there is no more urgent issue than to mitigate the damage of every veteran death on their family, but in particular, every death by suicide on the children that are left behind. All barriers to care and support for those children must be removed, and removed now. And those barriers are complex. It's everything from different types of funding arrangements and gold cards, and in short, and it's just, I'm going to sound quite direct, I don't care. They must be removed because we owe it to these children, because the death of their parent is absolutely not their fault, and we cannot let them go into teenagehood nor adulthood believing that it is.
Yeah, very well said, very emotive, Renee. It's it's just sad. It's sad because it's like all things with children, as I say, when we've got so just unassociated with defence. But children are innocent. Is the way I look at them. They're innocent, and they're directly, the protection of them and what they're influenced by is directly responsible to the parents. And in this case, it's just it's just a sad state of affairs. I think that's commendable. Renee is in to just break that down and we don't need to talk over it. You're dead right. I'd like to just bear with me flicking some pages here. I just want to jump. We're sort of getting close on time. I want to just talk about some statistics briefly. So it's a bit numerical, but I think it's extremely, extremely important. And also how some of the data, so how some of the information is captured, or in particular in this topic, how it hasn't been captured. So first of all, there was a consensus last year, and that consensus, the consensus is on persons who have served in Australia, and there was 581,139. So just short of 600,000 Australians reported as being current or ex-serving personnel. Another thing I read in the report is, and I believe it's 100 is 150. So every time a incident happens, like an attempted suicide or a suicide to a defence person, we look at, you know, what's called an ink blotting effect or a mushroom. Again, use what analogy you want, but how far does the impact of that flow out? Okay, and it's reported it's affecting about 150 plus personnel. So, you know, when we look at, we've got 600,000, just under 600,000 persons either serving or ex-serving in Australia. Then start doing the maths that every time something happens to one of those persons, noting that we've had hundreds of suicides. So this isn't, you know, a matter that's affecting some defence people over here. This is affecting Australia community quite more broadly than I think any of us were aware of. Another point I wanted to go over was in, sorry, just bear with me, I've just lost my way.
Hey, can I just build on that for a sec while you find your way? So I think just building on that, you know, you're quite right, around about rough figures, 600,000 Australians. But while we don't have figures on veterans' families yet, I'm sure you can figure it out if you can delve into the statistics and do some smart maths, which I can't. H, you might be able to. The best data we have at the moment in terms of families is those 600,000 veterans are in 1 in 5 households in Australia. So I think that shows you how much this affects the broader Australian community.
Yeah, it's huge, and that's the, you know, to use a not counterterrorism, a counterinsurgency term, which is ink blotting. So if you'll picture a piece of sorbent paper on the bench, and we drop a dot on it, and you watch that dot grow, and then you drop a dot over here, and then you drop a dot there. After several dots, because it's how, like I said, it's a counterinsurgency analogy, but how we join security in areas of hostility. You can use the same analogy or theory for, you know, all of these dots are almost, if they're not joined, some will be joined. It's extremely important. Just another thing I wanted to go over was, you know, it was found, which to me, I've sort of known this because I've, you know, tried to seek information and find out numbers over the last years. And what's been determined to date, there are a few organisations and a couple of new ones, which one I'll go into in particular. But out of all of the data sets and all of the information that was provided to the Royal Commission, there is not one single source that was considered as reliable. So again, very important to note that out of all these numbers and information that we have, there is still a large quantity of unknown. We just don't know because it's not reportable. Sorry, not reportable, it's just unknown. And I think that's really important. Now the defence, because once I got, after I discharged, and I can't remember what the circumstances were, but I looked into this, and I was absolutely amazed. I think it was after a couple of former 2 Commando persons suicided. And I was absolutely amazed that defence, because I wanted them to know more. So I'm looking for more information. And it absolutely amazed me that defence didn't have a database, defence in particular. So we have other government organisations and health organisations that have these databases. Defence should have a database. Defence now has a suicide database. Now, it was started in 2015, but it only covers deaths from 2000 onwards. So our own database, you know, is, you know, it was only started recently, unfortunately. And again, there's so much data that just isn't in there yet. It's good that
that's a really important point, H, and I'm sorry to interrupt there.
No,
but
don't be sorry, go.
A lesson from some of the consultation work that we did, which led to our first submission to the Commission, really demonstrated to me through the qualitative evidence we were collecting that unfortunately veteran suicide is not a new issue. The problems that are being surfaced at the moment have existed and have gone back generation upon generation upon generation. the problems that are being surfaced as well are not new. It's just that we're talking about them in a public forum for the first time.
Yeah, no, yep, that is an excellent point, and it's noted, as you would all know all too well at the start of the report. It's that finally, we're talking about things and talking about them very openly, especially some of the lived experiences, and that things are just being said. To quote Renee, which is, I might use your quote a bit, let's just get on with it. So we need to get that information out there in the rawest terms. It's not nice. This is an extremely emotive, extremely complicated subject. Just before I just before I start wrapping up, I always use another example. We're talking about and trying to help people understand, the mind. And again, I'm not a psychologist. If I go outside in a moment, I break my arm, and then I was to run over that arm and set that arm on fire, it basically caused an immense amount of trauma to my arm. I'll go down to that hospital, and piece by piece, the surgeons will prioritise, and where they'll do the burn in last through a skin graft, they'll fix the bone, they'll get the plate, they'll do the surgeon. You get the point. But by the end of today, they'll know exactly how to fix every single component of my arm, no matter how bad the trauma is of it. It'll be fixed, or the plan on how to fix it will be pretty well in play. And Renee would know this all too well with her husband's accident. Now, when we have trauma inside our head, so when we're talking mental health, things that are occurring in our brain, there's no map. There is no map. And this just, I have to say this to people all the time, and myself, it's the most, we've got all the experts in the world and all this. It's just it's such a complicated and emotional issue. So again, I think we need to look at the data sets. We need to keep compiling stuff, and we need to overlay, to use an intelligence, term of fusion, which is what they're trying to do here, which again is extremely difficult. We're fusing the data, the numbers, and these lived experiences, and they're doing the best job they can to put these two facets together. And then out of that, we'll drive things. But I just wanted to make that point. We can't underestimate how difficult that is. It's extremely difficult. I'll hand back to Renee and then to Alex to close. I think it's best we sort of start trying to wind up because of the time. I would like to, there's many points I'd like to reiterate, but I won't, because otherwise I'm just repeating things we've gone over. I want to make one point before I thank both of you. And that is, again, I've said this, but if people are listening to the people that listen to this, we encourage its widest bandwidth, so to share it, and we want that to occur to create more awareness. We want that to occur to hopefully help shape some decisions, as the intent is, and also to continue to break down any of the stigma that may be surrounding talking about this. We're all more than welcome to talk further on the interim report. If anybody would like that, I believe it hasn't got the amount of media that it should have received. It's such an important issue, and that's just been unfortunate because the way the media cycles work, and that's one of the main motivating factors of why we wanted to do this, just to get something out there. And on that note, I'll finish. So again, thanks very much, Renee. I can't thank you enough for coming on. Certainly your knowledge on all this and the work that you do is commendable. So thanks very much. And Alex, thank you for hosting. I did ask Alex to host it because I didn't want to do the work of editing. And then he makes a great host. So thanks again, mate. It's always good to work with you.
Thanks, H. Before I give, I guess, my acknowledgements and thank you too, I wanted to build on that point you raised before about your arm. Please, number one, please don't go and do that.
H has given that example before on this show. I think he's got it in for his arm.
I get mixed results with that example. Whenever I go to give it, I'm like, anyway. So
number one, please don't go and do that. But you're quite right. There is no map for the mind. And why is there no map? Because we're all individuals. We're all unique. And we've only ever existed once. So I think while that shouldn't be taken as, okay, well, there's nothing we can do. There's no map for the mind, but there's skills that we can build. And we can engage in particular types of therapies in order to move past some of the traumas and experiences we had. Some of them are really strange, but they are incredibly effective, and strange from a logical side of the brain's perspective. I think as a support system, what that means for us, so that as an individual, there are skills and there are treatments available. Number one, really important. Number two, as a system, that means we must take individuals as they come. We must recognize the fact that they are individuals. We must take a needs-based approach to policy, to legislation, to support and to care, not a time-based approach, not a category-based approach, but a needs-based approach. And I think the other point that I'll make in closing is, if nothing else, what we can see from this report and this Royal Commission is that veteran suicide isn't just government's responsibility. It's our collective responsibility. And it's also the responsibility of every Australian to say, hey, not fit for purpose, not meeting our expectations, do better. And for those of us that can do something with this information, we must do something with this information, because I think one of the critical errors that's been made before with every other report, or the 50 odd, all of those recommendations are made to government, but no one else takes responsibility. So there's a quote that basically says, what happened to me may not be my fault. It's a quote I learned in doing my own therapy. What happened to me may not have been my fault, but it's my responsibility. So it's the same with this. It might not be the issue might not belong to a particular organisation or a particular arm of the veteran system, but it's our collective responsibility to take action. And then the last thing I, of course, want to say is I just really want to thank you both. I want to acknowledge both of you for the work that you're doing in this space and helping us us as veterans families to raise our voices. And of course, words of gratitude from me can't express how grateful I am to you, to all of yours and my husband's two commando colleagues for letting me understand for the first time what not only the defence family, but what a family is. And that comes from a very deep place, because, there is no one better to have in a time of crisis or heartbreak than any of you and your colleagues. And I have the utmost respect for you all. And I'm happy to come in and around you and support you in the same way that you supported me all those years ago. So thank you.
Thanks, Renee. You're almost making me upset. So let's get on with that. No, I really appreciate that. Thanks, Dale. Thank you. It means a lot to me.
Well, look, thank you both for coming back to speak today about this very important topic. And it's a very personal conversation. It's something in the public sphere. It's something causing headlines, something we need more headlines about, as you said, H. But it's also deeply personal for your own lived experiences and people you know and loved ones. So thank you for sharing. This kind of topic is important. It also can be emotional labor, so that doesn't go unnoticed or understated. And if anyone listening to this has brought up anything, speak to someone, please. So thank you both for coming back today, and thank you to all those that have listened. You can find H and Renee's previous appearances on Life on the Line and our Life After Service video documentary series in the episode description of this podcast and on our website. You can also find our 5 previous panel episodes in seasons 2 and 3, focusing on the topics returning home, the Vietnam War, life after service, Australian infantry against the odds, and modern veterans. We're on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube at Life on the Line Podcast, on Twitter at LOTL Pod, and on LinkedIn at Thistle Productions. Reach out and continue this conversation. Our website is www.lifeonthelinepodcast.com. Life on the Line is brought to you by Thistle Productions, artwork by Big Cat Design, music by Dan Van Werkhoven. Thank you for listening, and lest we forget.